Hi there, AP Euro students, and welcome to today's lecture, which is going to focus on political states and other institutions of power during the Middle Ages. We are going to be covering a variety of political topics, such as government structures, things like kingdoms and empires. We are going to look at examples of other institutions of power, such as the Catholic Church, and also some non-traditional government structures. And also we will talk about the 100 Years' War, because war and conflict is another topic that falls under this theme. We're going to begin our lecture today talking about feudalism. Feudalism is one of the most important characteristics of the Middle Ages. Feudalism is basically a military and political system between kings, nobles, and knights based on loyalty and reciprocity. So there are some similarities to manorialism, and you can think of feudalism as being a level above manorialism. So if manorialism is the reciprocal relationship between lords and serfs, feudalism would be like the top three levels of the triangle you see to your right, the reciprocal relationship between the king and lords and vassals. So feudalism developed during the 9th century of the early Middle Ages, and like manorialism, it developed out of a need for increased protection. So during the 9th century and for the next few centuries, there was actually an increase in Viking invasions and raids coming from the Vikings of Northern Europe. Also, similar to manorialism, there had recently been a decline of a unifying empire in Western Europe. This was called the Carolingian or Frankish Empire, which we will discuss on our next slide. So between the threat of Viking invasions and the decline of the Carolingian Empire, these feudal kingdoms started to emerge in order to provide more protection for people. However, I want to emphasize that the growth of these feudal monarchies, these feudal kingdoms, was very, very gradual and took many centuries. So feudalism is essentially a network of power with the king at the top, and it is limited to essentially the warrior nobility. So this is really the relationship between the king and the nobility, the lords, the upper class. So we know that a lord or a noble is typically a local leader and a landowner. Often they have a title to distinguish their social status as well. A vassal in this system is a lord. It could be a higher lord or a lower lord, or noble, right? Lord and noble, we can use those terms interchangeably, who have sworn an oath of loyalty to the person above them in exchange for land. So for example, if you look at the triangle here, the lords in the second tier, we can think of those maybe as higher lords or more powerful nobility, have sworn an oath of loyalty to serve the king, meaning they will provide military service to the king when he asks for it. In return for that military service, the king will give those lords pieces of land, which are called a fief. Again, a fief is a piece of land that is granted to a vassal in exchange for service. So something I want to make clear is that a vassal is anyone who has sworn an oath of loyalty to the person above them within the system of feudalism. So the higher lords have sworn an oath of loyalty to the king to provide military service, and the lesser lords in that third tier of the triangle have sworn an oath of loyalty to the lords above them, and therefore also to the king, to provide military service when need be. So there can be multiple levels of lords and vassals in this network of oaths and loyalty. And again, a vassal receives that land in return for their military service, that fief. And this was one of the best ways for the nobility to expand their local power, through gaining more land, through gaining more titles, by serving the king, by providing him military service or counsel or whatever else he might request. right? And the king was the only one who had the power in this system to dispense titles and to dispense land. Now, in this system, a king is more powerful than a noble. However, the nobility still held considerable power throughout Europe. Now, I'm going to explain what makes a king special and different from a member of the nobility. So, kings were distinguished through an anointment. That's sort of a religious ceremony performed by an ecclesiastical authority. That's basically a member of the clergy, someone who works for the church. So the king is distinguished through an anointment by this ecclesiastical authority in a sacred rite. Okay, so the church has identified that this king is special, right? He has special permission by the church to rule. And so because the kings have this sort of special identification by the church, they are seen as higher in status, of course, than the lords and the nobility. And this is why many kings are treated with such reverence and there's so much ceremony, because it's almost like the king or the royalty are like these semi-divine figures. Because they have been approved by the church, they deserve a similar level of respect and deference. And this is why many kings throughout history claim to rule by the grace of God. And again, it is this factor that differentiates them from the nobility. And of course, this also means that kings had the power to grant titles and land in reward for the loyalty of the nobility. And like I said, this is how lords and nobles became more powerful. So that's the incentive for the lords to obey the king as well. However, feudalism is still a very decentralized system of government. I want to make sure you write that down. It is a decentralized system of government. Yes, there is a king at the top of the political period, but in reality, they had very little power over their kingdoms because they were dependent on the nobility to help them raise armies in times of conflict. And also, they depended on the nobility to help them rule the various provinces and different regions of their kingdom. So feudalism is a system that the nobility will always really like because they have a lot of independent power and autonomy from the king. However, as we get into the early modern era, we will see kings start to challenge this system and attempt to consolidate their power away from the nobility. But that's going to be another story for another day. Here is a map of Europe that sort of helps us understand how these feudal monarchies emerged and how they shaped the political landscape of Europe. So this map is from the High Middle Ages, and you can see that the political states are very, very different than what we're used to seeing in Europe today. There are many more smaller states, and these all represent different feudal kingdoms. So again, you can see there is not the traditional nation state like we're used to seeing. And even though these kingdoms are smaller, given the lack of technology and communication and transportation, the kings were very dependent on the nobility for their service and for their loyalty. And one of the themes that we will learn about over the course of the modern era is the gradual consolidation of royal power, the expansion of the nation state, so that Europe will eventually take the formation, the political geography of Europe will take the formation that is more familiar to us today. But again, that is a very, very gradual process that takes many centuries. So our next topic has to do with a medieval empire that exists briefly during the early Middle Ages. You may not have heard of this empire before or its king, but it's still very famous in European history. So this was known as the Carolingian Empire, and its most famous king was Charlemagne, one of the most revered kings and historical figures in early European history. So the Carolingian Empire originated in France, when the Franks, a barbarian Germanic tribe that had been one of the groups that invaded the Roman Empire, They end up settling in Western Europe, in the area that is known as France, and this is actually where France gets its name. And they began to rise to power in Western Europe and carve out some territory for themselves. And eventually that Frankish kingdom will become the Carolingian Empire. But there's something else that makes the Franks special, especially in comparison to other barbarian groups. Very early on, the Frankish leaders, the Frankish kings, converted to Christianity. Now, this is significant because by converting to Christianity, they won support from other Christians in the region, and also they won support from the Christian Church and the Pope in Rome. And this sets an important precedent that kings would seek acknowledgement from the church in order to legitimize their rule. Remember how on the last slide I mentioned that kings were special because they were identified by the church as having these special qualities that allowed them to rule? Well, essentially that tradition, that standard, was established by the Frankish kings in Western Europe. Now, of all the Frankish kings in the early medieval period, Charlemagne is the most famous. Charlemagne, which basically means Charles the Great, emerged as a very powerful feudal monarch that would eventually become the head of this massive empire under the rule of the Franks. So if we look on the next slide, you can see how expansive that empire was. It's all of that orange area. So the Frankish Empire means the same thing as the Carolingian Empire. So Carolingian Empire, Frankish Empire, same thing when in the context of this lecture. Now, this Frankish Empire expands all across France and Central Europe, even down into Italy. It is actually one of the largest political unifications of Europe since the Roman Empire. And because of its success, because Charlemagne was able to unify so much of Europe, he is often referred to as the father of Europe and seen as a symbol of European unity, especially when Europe does pursue another type of political unity in the late 20th century. Now, Charlemagne was also able to create administrative systems that helped him maintain control of this massive empire. In doing so, he also was able to establish economic and political stability. And so it is these factors that allowed him to unite Western Europe for the first time since the fall of Rome. And that political and economic stability allowed for a brief cultural resurgence, right? Remember how the Dark Ages and essentially the early Middle Ages are a time when there's very little learning, very little culture. But because of the political and economic stability provided by the Frankish Empire, it allows for the brief return of culture. We refer to this as the Carolingian Renaissance. Now, this is not the Renaissance that takes place in Italy in the 15th century. We'll learn about that in Unit 1. That's the major turning point from medieval to modern. Instead, the Carolingian Renaissance was a brief return of learning and culture and intellectual spirit within Western Europe, especially France, that was made possible by this stability provided by Charlemagne. So Charlemagne's success impressed the church so much that they decided to give him a brand new and very special title. Now, Charlemagne was, of course, a Christian, and so he supported Christianity and spread Christianity throughout his empire. Therefore, the church decided to crown him a new Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day of the year 800. Now think about that term for a moment. Obviously, it implies that he is the heir to the ancient Roman Empire. And we will see that European governments and European leaders are always trying to claim that they are the true heir of the Roman Empire, and they are carrying on the legacy of Rome. And in a moment, I will argue that there really is only one institution that successfully carries on the legacy of Rome. But we'll get to that in a moment. Also, he is the Holy Roman Emperor. So he is the heir to classical Rome, but he is also Christian. So this is an example of how Europe starts to merge their classical and their Christian claims. The other reason this is significant is because this action where the church crowns Charlemagne the most powerful political figure of the entire Middle Ages, because it is the church giving him this title, it symbolizes the superior authority of religious leaders over political leaders. All right, so this is an important precedent that is established here with Charlemagne and continues well into the modern era, that the church and religious leaders are more powerful than political leaders like kings. Now, as we get to the later Middle Ages and the early modern era, we will see that there are some conflicts that emerge over this precedent as kings begin to challenge popes and popes try to exert their power over kings, and this leads to lots of political conflict and scandal that we will talk about another day. Now, unfortunately, when Charlemagne died, the emperor shortly thereafter died with him. This was not a long-lasting empire as well. His empire broke apart into 3 sections shortly after his death, as his sons fought for control of the empire, and this actually caused a brief civil war. But ultimately, the division of the empire was resolved by the Treaty of Verdun in 1843. The Treaty of Verdun would divide the Carolingian Empire into about 3 sections, a western half, a middle portion, and an eastern portion. And these divisions from the Treaty of Verdun actually foreshadowed the formation of some of the modern countries and borders we would eventually see in Western Europe. And unfortunately, the Treaty of Verdun brought an end to this brief period of political unity in Western Europe. And quite frankly, we would not see the same level of political unity in Europe at all until the formation of the European Union in the late 20th century. So again, there's a map of how large and expansive the Frankish Empire was at its height under Charlemagne. Now I want to talk to you about another empire, which is a little bit non-traditional compared to maybe previous empires you have studied, and it's one of these more non-traditional forms of government. It is known as the Holy Roman Empire. And so this may remind you a bit of Charlemagne, right, who was given the title of Holy Roman Emperor, but if you look at the map, you can see that this empire is located more in Central Europe. So let me explain how we got from Charlemagne to the Holy Roman Empire. So Charlemagne's title of the Holy Roman Emperor died with him, at least temporarily. And the concept of the emperor and the Holy Roman Empire was revived in 962 when Otto I, a powerful German prince, was crowned the Holy Roman Emperor. That's what HRE means. Except in this situation, he was not given the title by the church in this big fancy ceremony. He was actually elected by his peers. He was elected by other German princes. And so this revived the concept of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, the Holy Roman Empire is not a traditional empire we might think of with the old Roman Empire or even the Frankish Empire. This Holy Roman Empire was a very loose political organization of Central Europe. It is not by any means a traditional kingdom. It is a very decentralized form of government. Frankly, the Holy Roman Empire consists of 300 sort of semi-independent states. So there were 300 little German states throughout this central region of Europe, places that include modern Germany and the Czech Republic and Austria and Switzerland and northern Italy and even parts of France. This whole region was considered part of the Holy Roman Empire. And with 300 different little states, That also meant there were 300 individual and independent political leaders. So that means that the Holy Roman Emperor will have fairly limited power. We'll talk more about that in a moment. However, similar to what Charlemagne and the Frankish Empire achieved, this Holy Roman Empire was attempting to merge those classical and Christian claims. And again, Otto I and subsequent emperors proclaimed themselves and the empire the Christian continuation of ancient Rome. Now, the Holy Roman Empire actually becomes an institution that will last for many centuries in European history here in Central Europe. The Holy Roman Empire provided a small amount of stability, but the power of the emperor himself was fairly limited for two reasons. The first is because he was a subsidiary to the Pope, meaning he worked for the Pope, right? He was not more powerful than the Pope. He had a close relationship to the Pope, but he was still beneath the Pope politically. And also, the Holy Roman Empire utilized a system of feudalism which weakened the emperor's power. Now, this system of feudalism was even more decentralized than we will see in other more traditional kingdoms, and it allows the princes of the empire, those other political leaders, to retain a great deal more power. So this means that the Holy Roman Emperor could not really consolidate his authority in any meaningful or legitimate way. That he could not levy taxes, I mean, he could not issue taxes to other princes or other regions in the empire. So that meant without taxation, there was no support for a formal federal government. He also could not raise armies, like a state-sponsored army. If he wanted military support, he had to ask other princes to help send their armies if there was a conflict that they needed to fight. So again, that was very traditional feudalism. And even though the Holy Roman Emperor was usually a large landowner and a powerful leader in his own right, it was very difficult for him to enforce his will and his authority outside of his own hereditary estates. So you may be wondering to yourself, like, why would anyone want to be the Holy Roman Emperor if it's not actually that powerful of a position? Well, regardless, the Holy Roman Emperor was still a highly coveted position among the princes of Central Europe because of its relationship to the church, right? The Holy Roman Emperor always had a close relationship to the church. And this position was perceived as very powerful, again, because of the implication that it inherited the legacy of ancient Rome. Now, after 1438, the Habsburg family, who are the traditional rulers of Austria, occupied the Holy Roman Emperor title for the next 300 years until about 1740. They did not technically inherit the title from generation to generation, but they were able to establish themselves as the traditional leaders, and the German princes would continue to elect Habsburg rulers into the position over and over again. Now, the Holy Roman Empire will probably reach its peak in the 16th century when we see our most powerful emperor, that is Charles V. We'll talk about him in one of our early units. But that was really the peak of power and influence for the empire. After that, especially when the Reformation is established, it severely weakens the unity and the political power and influence of the empire across Europe, and of course its position of emperor, especially after the 30 Years' War. So the 30 Years' War is this long religious conflict in the 17th century that was fought in Central Europe. It was incredibly devastating, and that war really weakened the empire significantly after 1648, so that it was something that technically existed but didn't really matter. Also, the male line of the Habsburg family would die out in 1740 due to excessive inbreeding. And don't worry, I will tell you all about the Habsburgs and their peculiarities another day. And finally, in the early 19th century, as Napoleon conquered region after region of Europe, he got to the Holy Roman Empire and he asked himself, why does this thing even still exist? Because as Voltaire, the famous French philosopher, once said, it never really was holy or Roman or an empire in the traditional sense. And so in 1806, Napoleon dissolved the Holy Roman Empire. But still, when we look at that timeline from the 900s to the 1800s, that's 900 years. So the Holy Roman Empire is still an important concept, an important institution that will play a significant role in several topics that we discuss. So be prepared to hear more about the Holy Roman Empire and the role various emperors play in early modern history. Now we are going to move on to one of our non-traditional institutions of power, which is the Catholic Church. You may remember a few minutes ago, earlier in this lecture, I stated that many European leaders and governments will claim to inherit the legacy of ancient Rome. We're going to see this with various kings and kingdoms, with empires in Eastern Europe and in Russia. But I am going to argue that the legacy of the Roman Empire is best found in the Catholic Church. Now, the medieval church was only one single institution for Western Europe. There was no Protestantism yet. That doesn't begin until the 16th century. And the medieval church is essentially what we consider to be the Catholic Church today because it had the same structure and system. So let me tell you a little bit about the history of the Christian church and how it was established in Rome during the classical period. If you are a Christian or someone who is faithful, then some of this information may be very familiar to you, especially if you're Catholic. But if you're not, then I still encourage you to pay attention because this slide actually includes a lot of important information, a lot of important terms that we will continue to use regularly and we will continue to refer to throughout the course, especially in the next few months. So again, we're still on that first bullet point, which is how the legacy of the Roman Empire is found in the Catholic Church. I want to tell you a little bit about that history. So Christianity was brought to Rome by St. Peter, one of the disciples of Jesus Christ. And like many of those disciples and apostles, St. Peter was a missionary. His role was to spread the gospel, to spread this new religion of Christianity. And he came to Rome and was able to establish, essentially a church in Rome. And therefore, St. Peter is considered to be the first bishop of Rome. That actually makes him the first pope. Now, you might know that the pope is the head of the Catholic Church, but the official title for the pope is the Bishop of Rome. And all of the popes that we see throughout history, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them, all those popes are considered successors or heirs to the throne of St. Peter. St. Peter is, of course, a very, very famous figure in the Christian tradition because he was able to, not only because he was able to establish this Christian church in Rome, but also because he was one of the early Christian martyrs. You may know that some Roman emperors did persecute early Christians, especially in that first century of the Common Era, and St. Peter is one of the more notable martyrs. He was crucified outside the city walls of Rome in an area that we now know as Vatican City. And in fact, St. Peter's Basilica, which is this huge, beautiful church, you can think of it as sort of like the mothership of Catholicism. St. Peter's Basilica is supposedly built over his grave where he was crucified. Now, as the Christian church developed over those first few centuries, while the Roman Empire still existed, it began to take on many of the characteristics and culture of the Roman Empire. For example, the hierarchy of the Catholic Church is very similar to the hierarchy of ancient Rome, which we will discuss momentarily. Christianity also saw another major success in 1313 when the Roman Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity. By that point, Christianity had become a very popular religion among the people of the Roman Empire, and Constantine himself converted to Christianity after a significant battle as emperor. And by legalizing Christianity, Constantine was able to grant the church lots of land, lots of income, which of course helped its legitimacy, its stability. It helped establish the church as a real powerful institution. Constantine also held a council of church leaders to help standardize the basic beliefs and structure of Christianity. So he really helped legitimize the church to become a real and powerful institution. And then later in the century, in 380, another Roman emperor would actually make Christianity the official religion of the empire. So now I want to talk a little bit about the structure of the church, because the church, as a sort of somewhat political institution, has a hierarchical structure that is not altogether that different than a government, right? And we're going to see that much of the hierarchy of the Catholic Church is similar to the hierarchy of ancient Rome. So I'm going to move on to this slide here, so you can see the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church, which still exists today. At the top of the church hierarchy, we have the Pope, and his office is known at, or his position is known as the Papacy, right? So if we refer to the Papacy, that refers to the position in the office of the Pope. The official title for the Pope is the Bishop of Rome, like we mentioned, because the Pope is considered to be the heir to St. Peter, the first Bishop of Rome and the founder of the Christian Church. Now, the Pope is, of course, the spiritual leader of the Church. The Pope sort of has this direct connection to God, and is treated as a very holy, a very special figure, right? There's enormous reverence and respect for the Pope. He is usually referred to as His Holiness. The Pope not only helps lead the church and guide the church spiritually, but the Pope can also help regulate doctrine. That's the beliefs and systems within the church. And the Pope is a position that is actually elected by the College of Cardinals. So the College of Cardinals is the position right below the Pope. There's probably about 190 to 200 cardinals worldwide in today's church. During the Middle Ages, it was probably a few dozen at most. And the College of Cardinals represent sort of the senior leadership of the Catholic Church. They're very similar to the Roman Senate. So think about that for a moment. The Pope is sort of like the Roman Emperor, and then the College of Cardinals is very similar to the Roman Senate. So you can start to see how the church is modeling itself after that Roman political structure. Now, the cardinals are these old men who wear red robes. That's usually how they are identified as a cardinal. They also serve as bishops for different areas in the world, especially across Europe, bishops or archbishops, and we'll talk about that position in a moment. And they play a very important role in the leadership of the church. The cardinals represent more of the elected government of the church, and they help run a lot of the church bureaucracy. They advise the Pope. They also help to facilitate the process of canonization, which is saint making. So there's over 1,000 saints in the Catholic tradition, and saints are regular real life people who are famous for their martyrdom or their miracles, and so they are given this special status by the church that makes them these sort of divine figures that Catholics can then pray to, and saints represent all types of different things that you might pray for, and we can talk about that more later. Again, the cardinals again help run the church. They advise the Pope. They facilitate the process of canonization. They also serve as bishops or archbishops for the region they are from. But one of the most important roles that the cardinals play is that they will elect a new pope when the old pope dies. So when someone is elected pope, traditionally they serve for life. There's only been a handful of times in history where a pope has resigned, and one of those exceptions was very recently with Benedict XVI. And when the pope dies, of course, there is a lot of grieving, a lot of ceremony. It's considered a very tragic event, but then the cardinals are charged with this sacred duty to elect a new pope. And so when the pope dies, all the cardinals come together in Vatican City, which is located in Rome, and they sequester themselves in a room known as the Sistine Chapel, which we will learn about in Unit 1. It's kind of like it's one of the most beautiful chapels within Vatican City. It's not the big church, which is St. Peter's. It's a smaller one, but it equally is famous. And from the College of Cardinals, they elect one of their peers to become the next pope. And I'm sure you're going to see a couple papal elections in your lifetime. There's lots of news and media coverage over it. And everyone is going to be talking about the chimney and the smoke that comes out of the chimney. Because every time the cardinals hold an election, basically they're nominating someone within their college. If the election does not produce a majority for a single candidate, the ballots are burned and the smoke comes out one color, I think black. However, if a majority is achieved and it is clear they've elected a new pope, they burn the ballots and the smoke comes out white. And everyone is gathered in St. Peter's Square outside Vatican City watching the smoke, and they're watching the chimney to see what color the smoke is. And when the smoke comes out white, there's massive celebrations. And shortly after that, we meet the new pope. And when a new pope is elected, he also gets to choose a new papal name for himself. So, for example, our current pope is named Francis I. Now, that was not his birth name, but Francis I is a very interesting pope. First of all, he is the first non-European pope to be elected. And also his title, Francis I, he named himself after Saint Francis, a saint who represents certain values and virtues and qualities. And so by naming himself after that saint, it implies that he wants to utilize and instill those same values and virtues and have that define his leadership as pope. Now that was a bit of a tangent, so if you didn't get all of that down, that's fine. The most important thing to know is that the College of Cardinals helps to elect the next pope. All right. Like I said, anyone who is a member of the College of Cardinals is also going to serve either as an archbishop or a bishop. Now, I'm actually going to jump down to the bullet point about bishops first before I go back and tell you about archbishops, because I think it will make more sense that way. So, a bishop rules over a diocese, and a diocese is the main administrative unit of the church. Okay, so for example, you can think of an archdiocese, which is a collection of many different dioceses, as a school district. And then an individual school is a diocese. That's a metaphor, of course, right? And so the way the church organizes land, and not land that it owns, but just territory around the world, is through creating dioceses. So, for example, we live in the Diocese of Tucson. And every diocese has a bishop that leads it. The bishop supervises all activities in his own church. He also visits other churches in the diocese. He helps provide religious instruction for new clergy, especially new priests in training. He helps organize charity for the diocese and maybe other diocese-wide events or initiatives. Now, in the Middle Ages, the position of bishop was considered very powerful and could be a very profitable position as well. And so since the bishop usually had his own church, it was important for that church to be impressive and fancy. And so technically, the church for the bishop is known as a cathedral. You may have heard that term before. So a cathedral is the seat or the church of a bishop. And that's why in Europe, There's lots of very fancy cathedrals that you will see, all across the continent. So let's go back up to an archbishop, because I think it will be easier to understand what an archbishop does. An archbishop rules over a larger area known as an archdiocese, which is several dioceses collected together. Okay? And the archbishop plays, again, that sort of leadership role. He is responsible for making sure the bishops below him follow all the church rules, that they are doing their job. Right. And so, of course, an archbishop position is more prestigious and more powerful than a bishop. And anyone who is an archbishop or a bishop can be nominated to become a member of the College of Cardinals. And then jumping down to the last bullet point in this list of clerical positions, we have the priest and his parish. So again, if we are thinking as a diocese, as a school within a district, and the bishop as the principal of that school, then a parish would be an individual classroom within that school, and the priest would be the teacher. So a parish refers really to an individual church community, and each parish has a priest assigned to it. A priest performs all of the same duties as a bishop for his individual parish. His primary responsibility is to preach to and educate the laity. The laity, L-A-I-T-Y, refers to regular people like you and I who are not members of the clergy. We do not work for the church, and we have not taken those special vows. Speaking of vows, anyone who wants to become a member of the clergy, meaning anyone who wants to work for the Catholic Church, must take vows and must have certain qualifications. The most important qualification is that you must be male. There are no female members of the Catholic clergy. There never have been, and it does not look like there ever will be. This is something they're very strict about. Yes, women can become nuns, but that's sort of a unique group outside of this traditional hierarchical structure. There's never going to be a female pope. There never has been. There never will be. There's never going to be female bishops or priests. Now, other Christian religions will allow women to become religious leaders, but Catholicism is very clear that this is a boys-only club. No girls allowed. So in addition to being male, that's the most important requirement, if you become a member of the Catholic clergy, you must take 3 vows, and you are required to follow these vows for your entire life that you are in the clergy, which is generally your entire lifespan. So all members of the clergy must take a vow of poverty, meaning they must live humble, simple lives, sort of emulating that life of Christ. They should not have overly indulgent or luxurious lifestyles. They have to take a vow of obedience, meaning they must, follow the rules and expectations of their position. They must listen to their superiors within the church, and of course, they must always be good Christians in everything that they do. And the last vow that they are required to take is a vow of chastity. Chastity means no sexy time with themselves or anyone else. So this is also known as celibacy, C-E-L-I-B-A-C-Y. So members of the clergy are not allowed to engage in any type of sexual activity. And this is important because this is seen as what really sets the clergy apart from the laity, so normal people. By refusing to engage in any type of sexual activity, the clergy is considered to be more spiritually pure or morally superior to the laity, and that allows them to focus on their faith more clearly. Now, we will see that there are times in history, especially in the later Middle Ages and the early modern era, where not all members of the clergy are good at following these vows. As the church becomes more powerful and wealthy, there is going to be lots of opportunity for abuse, corruption, and naughty behavior. So let's move on to that next bullet point, a second one from the bottom. The Catholic Church becomes the most powerful and wealthy institution in the West. I've mentioned this before. One of the reasons for this is because after the collapse of Western Rome, cultural unity in Western Europe is provided by Christianity. The church is able to bring in considerable income through its large land holdings and also through the charity that people give the church. And the church was also able to play an important role in people's lives and become a cornerstone of European culture and identity in the Middle Ages because they promised, this spiritual salvation. Think about it. In the Middle Ages, life was very hard for most Europeans, and the church promised compassion and they promised salvation if people were good Christians in their life. So they basically said, yes, life is difficult now, but if you're a good Christian and do all the things we tell you to do, then you are going to have, a blissful, eternal existence in heaven. Right, so work now, pay it, it's hard now, but you're going to get the greater later when you die and you go to heaven. And also, throughout much of history, most Europeans were illiterate and therefore were entirely dependent on members of the clergy to read and interpret the Bible for them, which meant that the church had a lot of control over various interpretations of the Christian faith. And that will, of course, be an issue that the Protestant reformers complain about when we get to the 16th century. So the last point I want to make about the Catholic Church, and this is a point that also helps us understand how it is really this sort of semi-political institution, is the Catholic Church actually has its own legal code, which we call Canon Law, and its own judicial system, which are known as ecclesiastical courts. So this legal code, this canon law, is a legal system specifically for the church, created by church leadership in the early Middle Ages. It is really a fully developed legal system with lawyers and judges and courts and a fully articulated legal code. And this is another example of how the Roman Empire influenced the modern Catholic Church. This legislative style and many elements of the legal code were actually adopted from the Roman law code of the Old Empire. And we'll talk about how that Roman law code was preserved by the Emperor Justinian of the Byzantine Empire on the next slide. But to summarize, I know this was a lot of information just for one slide, but I promise you it's important. It's very relevant for our course. And so I want to make sure that you are clear on the structure of the church. All right, you should know what each of these roles means: the Pope, the Cardinals, the Archbishop, a bishop, a diocese, a priest, a parish, right? I want to make sure you are very clear on that terminology. So I would encourage you to take some time with this slide when you do your review to make sure that you understand it. And if anything about this is unclear, again, please write down these questions so that you can ask in class. We're going to move on now to another empire that will exist in the Middle Ages. However, this one is in Eastern Europe, and this empire is known as the Byzantine Empire. Now, you may remember that when we talked about the transition between the ancient and medieval time periods, the turning point, which really defined that transition, is the fall of the Western Roman Empire. However, the Roman Empire that by that point was so expansive, it had been divided into a western half with a capital based in Rome and an eastern half with a capital based in Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul in Turkey. And even though the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the Eastern Roman Empire would continue to survive. One of the reasons they were able to survive that transition from antiquity to the Middle Ages is because the Eastern Roman Empire was wealthier, it was better defended, and it was more stable. Specifically, the capital of that empire in Constantinople, I'm going to show you on this map where that is. So Constantinople is right over here on that peninsula between the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea. That's modern-day Istanbul in Turkey, but historically that city is known as Constantinople. So anyways, the city of Constantinople was a very wealthy, cosmopolitan, multicultural city that was heavily involved in commerce, meaning many trade routes that came from the Mediterranean and northern Africa, from the Middle East, even from Central Asia and the Far East, came through Constantinople. So it was a major trade hub as well in antiquity and throughout the Middle Ages. So this Eastern Roman Empire will actually become known as the Byzantine Empire. So during the Middle Ages, we call it the Byzantine Empire, and it will actually last for about another 1,000 years until its collapse in the 15th century. And the Byzantine Empire takes on a very different character and culture than the Western Roman Empire. That's part of what makes it unique. The Byzantine Empire will be Christian, but it will start to practice a form of Christianity that will eventually be known as Orthodox Christianity. They also are going to have key political differences from Western Europe, key cultural differences from Western Europe, and key language differences. Most importantly, the Byzantine is a Greek-based culture. All right, it becomes a Greek-based language, a Greek-based culture, whereas Western Rome had always been based on the Latin language and more Latin culture. So that's really a way to think of the difference. The Byzantines are more Greek, whereas the Romans in the West were more Latin. Now, the most famous of all of the Byzantine emperors is a man named Justinian. You can actually, the illustration on the left of your screen depicts Justinian in the middle there with the purple robes. Justinian ruled in the 6th century, so just about 1 century after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and he is by far considered to be the most significant Byzantine ruler. There are a couple reasons for this. Justinian was able to build his military and expand the Byzantine territory in an attempt to rebuild the original Roman Empire. So if we look back on this map here, everything that is in red here in the Eastern Mediterranean region, that was the extent of the Byzantine Empire when Justinian became emperor. And he was able to expand the territory to everything that is orange, into northern Africa, into the Italian peninsula and these Mediterranean islands, even as far as the Iberian Peninsula. Again, his goal was to try to rebuild the old Roman Empire, because of course he saw himself as the heir to the Roman Empire. So here's another example of someone and something claiming the legacy of Rome. The Byzantine Empire and its emperors definitely believed that they inherited the legacy of the Roman Empire. Now, unfortunately, this territorial expansion was temporary. It did not last long after Justinian's death. But Justinian's greater achievement was the preservation of the Roman legal code. This is going to be an achievement that will last for centuries and continues to help define Western culture to this day. So essentially, Justinian had his bureaucrats and his scribes gather together all the information they could find about the Roman Empire's legal system. And they read through it, they organized it, they cleaned it up, they got rid of contradictions, they clarified confusions and inconsistencies, and they basically cleaned it up to have one very well put together legal code based on the laws of ancient Rome. And this, of course, was used to help establish the legal system of the Byzantine Empire. But also, by preserving the Roman legal code, he's able to allow many other leaders and governments and civilizations throughout throughout Western history and Western civilization, utilize that same system. The Catholic Church uses part of it. Many Western European governments will use part of it. We even see its influence in the U.S. legal system. The other great achievement of Justinian is that he built this big, beautiful church in Constantinople that is known as the Hagia Sophia. And I'm going to spell that for you because I want you to Google it. The Hagia Sophia, Hagia, Hagia Sophia, Sophia. And again, if you have a chance, pause the lecture and Google Hagia Sophia. It is this big, beautiful church. It is an example of monumental architecture. You'll see it has some elements of ancient architecture, like a big dome, but of course is used to sort of symbolize the greatness and the wealth of this empire, as many pieces of monumental architecture are. And the Hagia Sophia exists to this day. However, it is no longer a church. It is now considered a mosque and also recognized as a significant historical site in what is now Istanbul. And the last achievement of Justinian is that he made the Greek language the official language of the Byzantine Empire, which I mentioned was one of its defining characteristics. But by making the Greek language official, this established a permanent cultural difference from Western Europe and the traditions of the Western Roman Empire. Now we're moving on to our third bullet point, which is Byzantine politics and the economy. Now, while I said there were some similarities with how the Western Roman Empire had been run, there's also a few key differences. The first key difference is this concept known as Cesaro Papism. I'm going to spell that for you because it's a good term to know. Cesaro Papism is spelled Caesaro Papism. Again, that's Caesaro Papism, Cesaro Papism. And if you unpack that word, you might be able to identify the root word of Caesar, which implies Roman emperor, and papism. That might make you think of the papacy and the pope. So what that means is that the emperor of the Byzantine Empire was both the head of the government and the head of the church. So the Caesar and the Pope were one role. This, of course, is different than Western Europe because in Western Europe, the religious leader was the Pope, and he was separate and considered superior to the political leaders who were kings in their different feudal monarchies. And this will be one of the distinguishing characteristics and also an issue of conflict later on between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, but that's another story for another day. The Byzantine Empire was also known for having a very complex bureaucracy. A bureaucracy essentially is all the structure of a government underneath its leader, the offices, the departments, all the people who work for the government. So the Byzantine Empire had a very complex, very extensive bureaucracy, so much so that the word Byzantine is often used as an adjective today to describe something that is overly complex, almost unnecessarily complex, right? So you may think that, for example, learning about how to do school online is a very Byzantine process. In regards to the Byzantine economy, as I mentioned, Constantinople was a very affluent, meaning it was a very wealthy and powerful capital city, and it would remain so for many centuries. And this is due to the many trade connections and trade routes that came through the city. And its control of trade not only brought great wealth, but it also allowed Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire to have significant cultural influence across Eastern Europe. Now, the Byzantine Empire probably had its peak in the early Middle Ages under Justinian and a couple of his successors, but unfortunately the Byzantine Empire will meet some significant challenges, especially when Islam appears on the world stage in the 7th century, and Islamic empires began to emerge and become a major rival of the Byzantine Empire as early as the 8th century. So it is these Muslim challenges that will cause the eventual decline of the empire, which will last several centuries. These Islamic empires were very powerful and quickly claimed territory not only in the Middle East, but also were able to take territory away from the Byzantines in Africa, in Northern Africa, in Central Europe, and gradually the Byzantine Empire became smaller and smaller and smaller. There would also be some conflicts, especially some religious conflicts with Western Europe that would contribute to its decline, such as an event known as the Great Schism in 1054, and also the Crusades of the High Middle Ages. The Crusades would actually dramatically weaken the Byzantine Empire as well. And finally, the Byzantine Empire would collapse when the city of Constantinople fell in 1453 to an Islamic group known as the Ottoman Turks. And that's actually an important date. So I want to pause here and make sure that you underline that, you highlight it, but you make sure you get this in your notes. 1453 is the fall of Constantinople and therefore the end of the Byzantine Empire. This empire that lasted for almost 1,000 years exactly after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Now, the reason I'm taking a moment to point this out to you is because the fall of Constantinople is considered a major turning point in Western history. This is a major event that sends shockwaves throughout Europe. And it is one of the marker events that helps us identify that transition from the medieval era into the modern era. So we'll talk about the effects that the fall of Constantinople had across Europe, why it is considered a marker event in some of our early units, but that's another story for another day. Here you can see another example of how much the Byzantine Empire starts to decline after the expansion of the Islamic Empire. So on this map, the Byzantine Empire is that area in blue that is limited primarily to parts of the Balkans and the Anatolian Peninsula, whereas the Islamic empires have expanded significantly. And over the next few centuries, the Islamic empires will expand more, and the Byzantine Empire will continue to shrink. So this brings us to our final topic of the day, which is the 100 Years' War. So we're going to fast forward now to the late medieval period. The 100 Years' War was one of the disasters that helps characterize the late medieval period as a period of disaster and crises, right? A time that was very difficult to be alive. So the 100 Years' War is really a century-long conflict between England and France in the 14th and 15th centuries. This war began over a controversy regarding who could become the King of France. So in short, the old King of France had died, and usually the closest male relative to the king gets to become the next king. And in this situation, the old French king's closest male relative was actually the King of England, because royal families always married other royals. And so the King of England thinks, cool, this is awesome. I get to be the king of both England and France. But you can imagine how the French people, especially the French nobility, might feel about that situation. They certainly did not want to be ruled by an English monarch. France and England, as we will learn, have a traditional long-standing rivalry. They will always kind of be enemies and hate each other, at least until Germany becomes a real thing in the late 19th century. And then France and England become allies. But of course, that's another story for another day. For now, just recognize that this establishes that long enmity between France and England. So anyways, the French nobles refuse to give the French throne to the English king, and instead they choose a different, distant relative and allow him to become the new French king. Of course, the English king was hugely insulted by this, and this basically is what causes the war. Now, both monarchs of England and France were eager to go to war because they believed that war brought glory and prestige. War made them famous. You know, wars are what got their name down in your history textbook. And the nobility of both countries were also eager to go to war because for the nobility, war could also bring glory and prestige, but also opportunities for advancement and wealth. Remember, in the feudal system, if the nobility served the king and provided military service, then they would be rewarded with land and wealth and titles. Now, there's a couple reasons why the 100 Years' War is notable. It's a long, drawn-out conflict with many fascinating stories and things like that, but I'm going to try to really just stick to the highlights here. The 100 Years' War represents the changing nature of warfare, which is an important element to consider as we look at this transition from medieval to modern. When we think of traditional medieval conflict, you might have the image of an armored knight come to your mind. You know, an armored knight with the full suit of shining armor, riding a horse, jousting, things like that. But really, armored knights were expensive and not very practical. So very few knights were actually used during the 100 Years' War, and instead, armies utilized more foot soldiers. All right, so men who are maybe not as well trained as a knight, who are definitely not as wealthy. This is more like peasant soldiers. This group of foot soldiers are traditionally known as infantry in a military. Also, while the 100 Years' War did see a handful of major battles, there was also lots of raiding. So raiding is when an army will attack civilians, right? This was very common strategy for the English. They would attack towns on the northern coast of France, attack civilians, rape, murder, pillage, burn, and this was a way to sort of attack the French and weaken their morale. This is kind of like fighting dirty, if you will. Also, the 100 Years' War saw the introduction of new weapons. The English, in particular, started using the longbow, which was another archery-based weapon that was actually more powerful and deadly than the crossbow. And there's actually a very funny story that goes with the development of the English longbow that, if you remind me, I will tell you during our live class period. But I'm not going to talk about it now on lecture. This also was the war that saw the use of the cannon, the first major use of the cannon in warfare, which of course changes the significance of castles and fortresses because now cannons can blow right through castles and fortresses. One of the reasons this war was so long is because there was no consistent victory or momentum from either side. Sometimes the French were winning, sometimes the English were winning. As we can see here on this slide, you can see, in the various boxes or various squares, the blue territory belonged to the French, the pink territory belonged to the English, and the English were able to expand their territory at various times, and the French lost territory. But eventually the French will reclaim it all and win the war. Spoiler alert. Oh, sorry. Not quite done yet. Also, the war was regularly interrupted by necessary but intermittent truces because of other events that would affect the war, like the Black Plague that swept Europe during this period, or the peasant revolts that followed the Black Plague, especially in England and France. Now, the peak of the war actually comes in the early 15th century, in the 1400s, where the English come very, very close to completely winning the war, but at the last minute, France is able to rally and push the English back. And so that's the story, the one story I'm going to tell you about the 100 Years' War, because it's really the most famous story. In 1415, the Battle of Agincourt took place. The Battle of Agincourt is spelled Agincourt. Looks like Agincourt. And this was a major victory for the English, and it was largely due to the efforts of their king, King Henry V, who was this powerful, capable king that led the English to numerous victories. And he was able to lead the English to victory in the Battle of Agincourt. And at this point, the English are very, very close to winning the war. For all intents and purposes, it really does look like France is about to lose. However, France will have a comeback, and that comeback is largely due to this peasant girl named Joan of Arc. You may have heard of Joan of Arc before. So Joan of Arc was a French peasant girl who lived in a village. She was likely illiterate, but she was deeply religious. And as a teenager, probably around your age, she began to see visions of saints and angels, sort of these hallucinatory experiences where the saints and angels would speak to her. And they told her that in order to save France from the English, she had to go find the French prince, right? France had recently lost their king, and so the prince was supposedly in charge, but of course, the English were about to win. This is one of the reasons things were really precarious for the French. Now, Joan is able to travel to the military camp where the French prince is located. I believe his name was Charles VII. And she's able to gain an audience with the prince. And she's able to convince him to let her accompany the French military into battle against the English. This is remarkable. Why would a prince ever listen to this peasant girl? But apparently she was able to persuade him. And Joan of Arc is definitely a real person. She's famous for, dressing like a man, wearing some armor. She rallies the French army. She's inspiring, and her efforts, her motivation, her inspiration, her leadership is actually what allows the French to win their next battle against the English. This was the Battle of Orleans, Orleans. And the French victory at the Battle of Orleans is what really changed the course of the war and allowed the French to push the English back. Joan, of course, continued to ride with the French army. She rode in the battle, continued to provide them that support. Joan of Arc brought the French, not only provided inspiration, but she also provided a sense of national self-identity, a sense of confidence that the French army desperately needed. Unfortunately, Joan would eventually be captured and given over to the English, who were more than happy to get rid of her. In England, she was, I don't know if she went all the way to England, but she was accused of being a witch by the English and burned at the stake. However, France would win the war. One of the reasons France was able to war, I didn't mention this earlier, but the English king, Henry V, had died unexpectedly from dysentery, which is basically diarrhea. Not a very glorious way to die, right? And so the English lost their capable, powerful leader. Just at the same time, Joan of Arc was able to provide this inspiration and this sort of motivational comeback for the French army. So what is the overall significance of the war? So the 100 Years' War is one of the marker events that we identify as supporting that turning point, that transition from medieval to modern. And one of the reasons for that is because the 100 Years' War starts to introduce this concept of nationalism. Nationalism is the idea where someone's loyalty and identity is tied to a nation state, right? So you can think of it sort of like patriotism. Now, nationalism is going to be a more modern concept. We really do not see nationalism in the Middle Ages, and that's one of the reasons why the 100 Years' War is significant, because now the people of France or the people of England start to identify with their country, and they feel that pride for their country, not just for their king. And something that supported the growth of nationalism were these famous figures. Henry V becomes a famous figure in England, a national symbol, and then Joan of Arc, of course, becomes a famous symbol in French culture and history. Joan, of course, becomes a saint, and she is now considered the patron saint of France. And again, is a very famous historical figure that the French are proud of. So the growth of nationalism is probably one of the most significant elements of the 100 Years' War. Also, the military development and that changing nature of warfare that I mentioned earlier, new weapons like the longbow and the cannon, but also the new structure of armies with fewer knights and more infantry, which also means that this meant higher casualties. This is an example of how some battles are getting bigger and messier. But ultimately, there's still a lot of medieval traditions here, a few new modern ones that are introduced. Regardless, the 100 Years' War is a fascinating event that, again, helps us recognize that gradual transition from medieval to modern, as it contributes to the decline of a few medieval trends and characteristics, and also helps to introduce a few for the new modern era. And that is the end of today's lecture. Thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, please make sure you write them down so that we can discuss them in class the next time I see you. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day.